So welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to see you all even virtually and to introduce today's seminar speaker, Dr. Andrew Rypel. Dr. Rypel, let's be formal. Okay. Dr. Rypel is a associate a professor at UC Davis, and he's also an associate director of the Center for Watershed Studies. And before his time at Davis, he worked with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And Dr. Rypel is a freshwater ecologist and an ichthyologist, and has some of the best examples of research that I can think of really integrating science and policy and wildlife management. Kind of learned from Dr. Rypel kind of an approach for how to do science that involves thinking about inference from both observation, experimentation, modeling, and then adding in theory. And he does that kind of, I think, the four-legged stool model remarkably well. So it's really a pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Rypel. And with that, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm going to share my screen again, so hopefully this all works. Hey, can y'all see that? Okay, well, thank you so much, Lauren, for that lovely introduction. Very flattering. I'm not from California originally. California is semi-new to me. I'd come to California before, but I've been here now for about 5 years. And I wanted to share with you some of the lessons I've learned doing science in an interesting place, doing science with fishes in California, which are very special to me, obviously, but special to this area. And just some of the lessons I've learned doing this kind of work. So without further ado, let's get started. So I always like starting with these sort of graphs, talking about human population growth, which if you kind of were to point at the existential problem we're all facing, most of the problems are linked to these graphs. And it's funny, I remember when I was in undergrad, and the human population was like 6 billion people globally. And they were saying, oh, this is going to go to 9.2 by the year 2050. I was like, oh, is that really true? It is true. And we are on our way. Are we ever? So in California, for example, the number of people on the landscape has gone from 20 million people in roughly 1960 to about 40 million people currently. So over the course of one person's life, population has doubled on the landscape. And a lot of people I talk to say, well, that's California, you crazy Californians. But when you look under the hood at what's going on in all these other places, they're all experiencing the same sorts of trends, including in Oregon. So order of magnitude less people, but you've still more than doubled since roughly the 1960s. So we're all going up. And this places pressure on ecosystems. Now, as Lauren mentioned, I am an aquatic ecologist. So I tend to focus on these sensitive taxa that respond fairly negatively to global change. This is from a classic paper by Anthony Ricciardi in the late 90s, kind of showing the projected extinction rates being higher for aquatic systems versus terrestrial systems. Observed extinction rates also follow this trend. And this is exactly what we're seeing as human domination of ecosystems across the globe unfold. Just as one example, this is a fish species that was recently declared extinct just this last year. This is the Chinese paddlefish. Look at how beautiful this species is. It has this completely unique rostrum. That rostrum's full of these things called the ampullae of Lorenzini, which allow it to sense zooplankton in the water, basically. There's only one other species of paddlefish in the world. It's American paddlefish. It's native to the Mississippi Basin. but this species is now gone from the planet. So it's sad, these are sad trends. And I've kind of developed a research program that seeks to study the major factors that contribute to declining freshwater species, declining fishes. So that can be habitat loss, climate change, alien species, overfishing, and different forms of pollution. I'm interested in all these different factors, but particularly the way that they can kind of interact with one another, create synergistic negative impacts, and then how we can kind of potentially manage our way out of some of these problems. Sometimes I have a version of this Venn diagram where the things spin around and stuff, but I'll save you save you the animations this time around. So I work in California now. We got this awesome flag. And as much as I love the flag and I love bears, I've never seen a bear in California. There are black bears in California, but I've never seen this kind of a bear. So I'm going to try to convince you that we should have a fish on this flag instead. I'm going to talk a lot about salmon today, and so maybe I can convince the state of California to change the flag. It'd be a pretty flag, right? Okay, so the state of fish diversity in California is not good. These are graphs that I show that often surprise people, but this is just a look at the diversity of freshwater fish species in California and their status. So there's about 100 species, native species in California, depending on how you add up, like things that occur in Oregon and California, it can be more or less, but it's around 100. But 83% of those species are in some form of decline. Most of our native fauna are not doing very well, and even a small section are already gone. And these trends have really appeared in recent history. So if you look at these trends over time, you'll see that basically since that 60s period where the population really grew, this is where you're seeing declining trends in fishes occur. So the number of stable species has gone down, number of vulnerable and endangered species have gone up. The extinct species are going up slowly, but not as quickly as some of these other lines are, so that there's a kind of an extinction debt to be paid there. But this is the background over which I'm trying to do science. It's very challenging. And again, some species are already gone. So this is the bull trout. This still occurs in Oregon, but not in California. Super cold water species, very vulnerable to climate change, very vulnerable to effects of dams. But we are losing species. And I have been toying around with a framework for studying ecological resilience that I really got introduced to this concept by working with Steve Carpenter at Wisconsin. And basically, it relies on the notion that most systems show very little signs of change up until you reach some sort of a threshold, after which point recovery becomes slow, difficult, and very expensive. So you can envision this at a certain level as just plotting two variables against each other. A variable you can control, for fisheries, say that's harvest or quality of the habitat, versus variables that you can't control, say climate change. You want to control climate change, but at a local level, you really can't. A local manager couldn't control climate change. So if you sort of buy into this framework, you can imagine two different points on this graph that both yield conditions that allow a safe operating space. So in the first scenario, the blue scenario, you could have, say not very much climate change, and you wouldn't really have to change very much to stay within that safe operating space. However, if you were to have a lot of global change, you would have to really dial down that y-axis value to stay within the safe operating space. You'd have to really reduce harvest or really improve the habitat, things like that. But I find this to be a useful heuristic tool for thinking about management and conservation. And I'm not going to kind of revisit this too much, but I wanted to put this out there as a framework that I think has potential for thinking about resilience. Okay, so I want to spend a lot of time talking about salmon. Make sure I'm doing okay on time. Yeah, so salmon, as they are in Oregon and the rest of the Pacific coast, are an incredibly important resource culturally, economically, and ecologically. You know, they bring marine-derived nutrients to upland ecosystems. They fertilize forests. They've been important to indigenous peoples for long, long periods of time. And they're important to us in modern times through fisheries, through experience of ecosystems. So we spend a lot of time thinking about salmon in California. Now, one of the things that makes California very unique compared to the rest of the country is how variable the climate is. I'm sure Lauren could speak to this thinking about plants, but this is a graph I really like that shows this. This is just showing the standard coefficient of variation in precipitation across the US. So for most of the country, precipitation is quite predictable. You kind of know what you're going to get. Not in California. There's incredible swings in wet years and drought years. And this is the landscape upon which a lot of the species evolved. So for salmon, we have lots of different ecologically significant units of salmonids, but these are 5. The runs that kind of have seasons tied to them are runs of Chinook salmon. So different kind of subspecies of Chinook salmon, basically, that are differentiated based on the timing upon which the adults migrate from the marine environment to the freshwater environment. We also have steelhead, which is a different species, but it's often grouped in with these. What's interesting is that what you can see here is that it's basically salmon in the rivers throughout the year. And what this reflects is an evolutionary history of bet hedging, where you had this high variation of wet years and dry years. And there's subspecies that are all capitalizing and basically playing at a casino in terms of their fitness. So it's just kind of inherently interesting for that reason. Sad part about salmon is they've been cut off from the vast majority of their natal habitat. So salmon would, run up the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. They enter into these alpine, upland ecosystems where they would spawn, and the juveniles would rear there. They'd come out to the Central Valley floor, which is that big flat space full of wetlands historically, gas up with food and resources on their way out to the ocean. Most of those natal spawning habitats are gone now. Dams have blocked salmon from reaching their historic spawning habitat. So you have these incredibly important fish that are just relegated to the Central Valley floor and are unable to ascend to those habitats that they really want to get to. These are a couple of pictures I really like. On the left is the first ever satellite photo taken in the 1800s. Kidding. This is an artistic recreation of what a satellite photo would have looked like of California in the 1800s. And then on the right is an actual modern satellite photograph. And it's just interesting to compare them. So, you can see a couple things straight away. You can see that the state was a lot greener. There was a lot more water in the Central Valley. There was a giant lake in Southern California. That's called Lake Tulare. It's since been completely drained. You could have taken a boat from Bakersfield to Stockton. It was the second largest natural lake area-wise in the US. That lake is completely gone. So for those of you that have seen pictures of the Aral Sea and what's happened to the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan, but basically the same thing happened in California. It just happened before we had satellite photos. So we've completely modified this landscape. You can see the amount of snowpack that was in the mountains. And there was much more snowpack historically. So the water cycle has changed in some fundamental ways. This is another artistic recreation from Laura Cunningham. She has this awesome book called State of Change, if you're interested in this kind of thing. It's artistic recreations of California from pre-European times. And, this is what the valley is thought to have looked like: a giant wetland complex full of wildlife, full of migratory birds, full of fish. That's all gone now, obviously. So this is what we're left with, or trends like this. This is the winter run Chinook salmon, and this has declined again in that period of time from the 60s, from annual runs in the Sacramento River that were over 100,000 spawning adults, to now we're lucky if we get 5,000 fish total. So this is a federally endangered run of salmon now, and a lot of effort goes into managing this. And at the crux of all this is a fundamental ecological problem, which is one of competition. So you have humans and ecosystems competing for the same thing, which is water. And reconciling this fundamental problem is at the heart of sustainability in California in terms of what I do. Lots of news stories published on fish versus water in California. You can read about it. Delta smelt is on Fox News on a regular basis. A lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about fish versus water. And these are what are generally categorized as wicked problems. I had this kind of in the title, but these are defined as problems that you just can't ignore. They defy straightforward characterization and straightforward solutions. And so my aim kind of for my research, as well as this little talk, is to just provide a few encouraging examples of how conservation success can be possible in this complicated landscape of wicked problems. So I want to start by showing you Putah Creek, which is our local watershed in Davis. This is a photo from a plane that I really like because it shows the dynamics that you're dealing with. It's a thin riparian strip and a freshwater system located in a sea of agriculture, a sea of people, 40 million people on the landscape. But there's a very interesting story that's occurring within the creek. So just for a little bit more context, Putah Creek originates in the Vaca Mountains and the Mayacamas Mountains. It then flows into an impoundment called Lake Berryessa. It has this kind of famous wormhole. This is the emergency spillway during wet years. It'll kind of flow and create this weird visual effect. People like to ride up there on motorcycles and look at it and stuff. It was, when I came to Davis for my housing visit, it was going. So I went up there. It was like one of my first memories of California was looking at the wormhole. But this is Putah Creek down below. Now, this is what's a little bit different from anywhere else I've actually worked. This is a dam that's located about 10 kilometers downstream from the Berryessa Dam. And this is a diversion dam. And it diverts about 95% of Putah Creek's water to a canal. You can see it in the bottom right corner here, which then is used for irrigation for ag as well as for people in places like Vacaville and other parts of Solano County. But they take 95% of the water, and I had to like triple check that number was accurate when I first started working on it. I said, "Is this accurate? Are they actually taking 95?" No, that's right. And they actually used to take more of it. So this is a photo of Putah Creek from the 90s. Look, even the cars couldn't survive back then. There was stagnant, nasty water. It was just kind of a horrible place to be a fish. And back then, they basically took all of it. There would be periods of zero flow or very, very low flow. And this was just an awful place to make a living as any sort of a species. Now, this gentleman on the right, his name's Peter Moyle, and he was a fish ecologist at UC Davis for a long time. And he actually studied Putah Creek before my time and worked with the University of California, the Putah Creek Council, and some other folks to actually sue for water for fishes in Putah Creek. They relied on a state fish and game code that stipulates that water has to be provided to keep native fishes in good condition, native fish populations. And it went to court, but it was never decided. They settled it out of court. And basically, the legal issues focused on keeping the creek from drying up, having that nasty water, having spring flows for native fishes that helps with their spawning, a fall attraction flow for salmon. There were no salmon at the time. There hadn't been any for very, very long periods of time. And otherwise, high flows. And basically what the water district does is they manipulate the water out of Lake Berryessa to provide these flows at critical periods. Now, I've had a grad student, I've had a couple grad students now working on the Putah Creek project, but this is Emily Jacinto, and she's my Putah Creek all-star. And she's working the screw trap here. But she just finished her master's. I'm going to show you some data from her work, which is kind of a retrospective on how the fish community has changed over time. So first of all, I want to show you this complicated three-dimensional plot. I really hate three-dimensional plots, but I think it actually tells the story of how the flows have changed in Putah Creek over time. So this is plotting flow versus year versus day of the year. And all I want you to do is focus on how before this dashed blue line, there were all these periods of very low flow, low to zero flow, which is that orange patch there. Now look what happens afterwards. You basically have sustained base flows occurring during the summer. That's the key, is having cold water available for fishes in the summertime in California. In the winter, there's not as much change. We do get a little bit higher flows recently, but having those flows in the summer are really important. And this is what's happened to the fish community over time. The proof's in the pudding, right? So we basically had a situation where non-native species dominated the fish community before the accord went into effect. And then afterwards, natives dominated. All right, now these are another set of complicated graphs. And this is an idea that I kind of stole from Scott Collins, who runs the Sevietta LTER. These are rank abundance curves of the fish community plotted over a long period of time, from the 90s to almost present day. And these are different sites along Putah Creek. And then the dots are coded to be native species in blue and non-native species in yellow. So every one of those curves is another year of data. I just want you to see that the number of blue points really changes as we go through time. So we're getting more and more native species that are dominating the fish community, particularly at these sites A, B, and C, which are kind of the more upstream sites that benefited the most from the flow restorations. The downstream sites haven't benefited as much, but you still see partial gains. You still see some of those subordinate species, native subordinates, becoming more abundant over time. And then this is another plot showing how the mean rank shift has changed over time. So this is a thing in community ecology that kind of can measure stability to some extent. And we were using Lauren's great R code, the code-in package, to calculate these. This is a mixed effect model fit to these data, different sites as random effects. But basically, the community is becoming more stable over time. So natives are starting to dominate, and the community is becoming more stable over time. And then a few years ago, a funny thing started happening. So prior to the 90s, there were almost no salmon. And then in 2013, about 10 Chinook salmon showed up. They were mostly strays from hatchery releases, but that number has increased every year since then. So in recent years, we get thousands of adult salmon now returning to Putah Creek. Again, this is 13 years after the accord was passed. So it took a long time to just attract a few salmon into the system, but now that's been growing and growing. Now, we run a screw trap in the creek, which is what you use to sample baby salmon. We capture over 30,000 juvenile Chinook salmon every year now. And that trap probably fishes at an efficiency of 50% or something. So you could probably multiply that number by 2 fairly safely. Now, as you start getting up to 100,000 juvenile salmon, you're starting to rival production rates at hatcheries. And this is all natural production that's just occurring because we're releasing more flow into the system. Salmon are finding a good place to spawn, are doing it, and the juveniles are migrating out successfully. So it's a novel and a reconciled ecosystem. It actually bears very little resemblance to the historic ecosystem. It's been altered in irreversible ways. The non-native species aren't going anywhere. They're still there. They're just becoming more subordinate over time. But the key here is that the humans are in charge. We're calling the shots and we're making the decision. We're going to manage this ecosystem for native species and for salmon production, maybe, as time goes on. So it's a great feel-good story. Okay, now I want to take you to another ecosystem in California, which is even more blown out. And this would be the San Joaquin River. So historically, you had two major arms of the San Francisco estuary. You had the Sacramento River, and you had the San Joaquin River, which is the one that went way down south to Lake Tulare, like I was talking about. The San Joaquin has been more impacted probably than any big river in California. It's been referred to as America's most endangered river, primarily because of water extraction issues. And it's just been another horrible place for fish to live. This picture here is of a run of salmon called spring run Chinook salmon. These occur in Oregon, by the way. And these are salmon that come into rivers in the spring as immature adults. So they're actually not sexually mature yet. They come in, and then what they do is they over summer in these deep, cold plunge pools high up in the mountains. So they'll literally spin around in circles in these deep plunge pools all summer long, mature in the freshwater environment, and then when rains come in the fall, they'll migrate further up into the landscape than they would otherwise be able to get. There's some thought that that may have been an advantageous life history historically. Now, what's interesting about spring run in terms of the San Joaquin River is that it's thought to have been the dominant run. This is now a federally threatened species. We're lucky if we get 30,000 spring run a year. And you look at some of these historical abundance estimates, it was upwards of over 500,000 spring run. These are habitats in the San Joaquin system, that are strongly affected by dams in the black there. So that's where those deep plunge pools would have once existed. So this is basically a run of salmon that's been particularly wiped out by dams. So they're basically they were eradicated from the San Joaquin in the 1950s, particularly when they put up a couple of very large dams like Freant Dam. But in around 2014, there was a reintroduction effort that was started to reintroduce spring run to the San Joaquin. And what our lab has been doing has been tracking the juveniles that are born and released in the San Joaquin out to the ocean. So to do this, we use a form of telemetry called acoustic telemetry. I wish that we could put GPS tags into fish, but it's a physics problem where the signal can't penetrate into the water. So we have to use an acoustics form of tagging. So these little tags right here produce a sound. They're literally making sound. And then you have receivers, basically listening devices that you park in the river to listen for these fish as they move around. Totally forgot. Usually I actually bring in as like show and tell one of these receivers to show you, but they're like this big. It almost looks like a rocket launcher or something. And you sink it into the river. There's a motherboard inside of this PVC pipe. It's basically a computer, and it's listening for these tags all the time. So we do surgeries on juveniles. We install these little teeny transmitters. This is actually the smallest transmitter that's currently available on the market. You can tag fish down to 65 millimeters. It's called a JSAT tag for those that are interested. And then we literally operate an array of about 200 receivers all along the San Joaquin River that listen for these fish as they make their way out. And by doing this, we can learn about where fish are having problems, where they're dying, how they're selecting routes as the delta complex presents itself different choices. I just want to show you a few salient results here. So first of all, what we see is that the salmon have very low survivorship through the system. Only about 0 to 5% of these fish make it out to the ocean. Just for a comparison, on the Sacramento River side, that number is usually 0 to 20%. And they often have the 20% in the very wet years. And then in drought years, it's 0 to 3%, often 0. We see that the fish have very high initial losses high up in the where they release these fish, and they generally survive pretty well, and then they have low survivorship again once they hit the estuary. Now, there's one particular fork where some interesting things happen. So the fish can go one way, and they can go to the delta or the estuary. They go the other way, and they wind up at this water plant here where they suck in water and pipe it down to Southern California. As part of this water operation, salmon gets sucked into this facility, and there's a salvage operation for those fish. So the fish actually get put into this net pen, and then they actually put them in a truck and they truck them back around to the estuary and release them again. One of the just amazing things we've found is that these fish that get salvaged at the water operation have higher survivorship than the ones that actually go down into the delta on their own. And basically the reason is because we're giving them a lift around some of these hard parts. So we've degraded the estuarine ecosystem so bad that the best route of survivorship is being salvaged at one of these water facilities and trucked around the delta. But it's an incredibly interesting place to work. We're doing some cool habitat mapping. And this is a system that I was kind of exposed to when I was in Wisconsin, where we put water sampling devices on a high-speed boat and link it up with a computer and have some data integrators. Very large data sets. It's truly big data. But we drive this boat at high speed, and it will literally map the water quality as we go along. So we can map like dissolved oxygen, dissolved organic carbon, nutrients and like nitrogen, chlorophyll concentrations with the greenness of the water. And what we're doing is we're trying to link the survivorship of those juvenile salmon to the habitat conditions that we're experiencing. So kind of understand these hotspots of death. And there is hope. Just recently, we've started having naturally reproduced, so just like Putah Creek, there've been some naturally reproducing salmon that are starting to come back. The first group of adults that came back were actually part of our first acoustic telemetry study, the year that we first did the acoustic telemetry on the fish. So there are more and more naturally spawning adults coming back. There's more and more natural production of these spring run occurring in the system. And so we do hope that, like Putah Creek, there's going to be positive progress on the San Joaquin side. All right, now let's move a little bit quicker. So real quick, wetland in the Central Valley. Most people don't realize, but there's a ton of rice farming that occurs in the region. Very important for wintering waterfowl that come down from Canada. 500,000 acres of rice. If you eat sushi in the US, the rice comes from the Central Valley. It produces 100% of the sushi rice for the US. And it's right outside of Davis here. Now, people have been looking at some conservation programs that have been developed to incentivize rice farmers to flood their fields in the wintertime for migratory waterfowl, and saying, those are really good programs. That arrested the decline of birds on the West Coast. Why can't we do that for fish? Well, we're working on that. So we're trying to develop a parallel framework for juvenile salmon, to rear juvenile salmon on rice habitat in the Central Valley. It was started by an NGO called California Trout about 10 years ago. And it's been one of my priorities since I arrived in California. This is from a recent paper we just published in PLOS. You can see these fish on the left here are baby Chinook salmon that have reared in winter flooded rice habitats for about a month. It's a little bit longer than we like to rear them. And look at how different they are than fish that reared in the channel of the river. So that skinny, nasty looking fish right there is the one that was in the river channel. And then these are ones that we reared in floodplains. They can grow like this because the fields are loaded with food, zooplankton, bacteria, bacterial food, detrital food webs, and you don't feed the fish at all. They're just eating what grows in these fields naturally when you flood them in the wintertime. So it's an incredibly interesting idea. We've done some experiments where we've prepared fields in different ways. Looked at fields that had canals versus those that had wood versus control fields, different ways of preparing fields. Just want to show you, these are just really cool experiments. So we worked with a farm to prepare this experimental matrix. Here they are, they're preparing it in the fall. Here it is, it's flooded up. And you can see the treatment with wood on the other, we actually use Christmas trees. Just trying to figure out kind of ways that we can do this that are going to work the best for salmon. Here it is from the air. Just a super cool experiment. Kind of pretty too. And this is my grad student, Rochelle Tallman. I'll show a picture of her next. She was kind of doing most of this work, so I'm not taking the credit at all. She's put so much hard work in here. And but in general, what we see is that the fish survive very well. We had one field that was kind of on the edge where wading birds got at them, but for the most part, they survived quite well. And we're doing some acoustic telemetry on these fish as well. So we're putting those JSAT tags in them. And when we release them in the river, we're comparing them to a control group that kind of are supposed to resemble kind of a hatchery release. So what we see is that this rearing strategy has a population effect potentially. And our next step here is to plug these results into a population model and ask some important questions about how we could scale this to change the population from a declining one to a growing one. And we're also trying to develop a NRCS practice standard to formally incentivize growers to participate in these activities, to engage in fish conservation, just like the bird people did. Okay, so I'm going to try to wrap this up to a useful point here. I like to share some salient lessons I've learned just from working on different things. And I actually wrote a blog on this. You can read the blog if you're interested in this kind of stuff. But one, look for questions science can, if you're interested in this translational kind of stuff, look for questions science can answer. People often say things that aren't based on science. And you need to look for those important science questions. Long-term research is really important. Slow change can elude our senses and can block our understanding. We have to have long-term studies. Unsurprisingly, money is really important. You have to have money to do science. You have to do money to do cool things. Oftentimes that means working with partners that are non-traditional. So it might not be who you think that could make a good partner for conservation stuff. Keep the momentum. If you get momentum, you got to keep it. And kind of going along with the money thing, be an equal opportunity collaborator and conservationist. I'm willing to work with anybody if they're serious about conservation. They don't have to agree with me on everything, but maybe we can agree on something. Get out there. It's easy for me to kind of sit in my office and write papers and things like that. But getting out, meeting people, talking to managers, that's where the good stuff really happens. And anybody can make a difference. You'd be surprised. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to do fancy things. You can make a difference locally by doing small things. This is a quote I really like from Margaret Mead. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, concerned citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. True words have never been spoken." And just a short note about students. I am extremely passionate about students. I'm passionate about and enhancing diversity in the STEM fields, and exposing students to examples of how science can lead to better conservation policies. It's so important that they see this and in their own work be able to contribute to better policies that make for a more sustainable world. And final point too, also science communication. We, in general, as scientists, we stink at communicating science, and we need to get better at that. That's something that a lot of young people are interested in now, and I think that's a good thing. Lots of other interesting work going on in the lab. So if you're interested in any of these things, just let me know. I'd love to talk to you about any of this. And I'll say thank you. I'll leave you with this piece of art by Ray Troll. Fish worship, is it wrong? I think we know the answer to that. And happy to take any questions you might have.
Thanks, Andrew. Let's see, do we want to do hand raise or just call out questions or throw them in the chat if you're feeling shy, and I'll say them for you.
You say them, Lauren.
Yeah, just say them. Well, I have a question. I'm going to just start us off because I didn't see a hand raised. So in the areas that salmon are coming back, like, and they hadn't been there before, has it been that like adults every year go there and just die, or like how do they know to go back?
Yeah, so the way this tends to work is that the streams where they've been extirpated are recolonized by pioneering salmon that are basically straying. So sometimes straying has been viewed as a kind of a negative thing by managers because they want all the fish to come back to whatever hatchery they were at or whatever stream they came from. But from an evolutionary standpoint, Pacific salmon evolved in post-glacial systems, very dynamic. You know, the geomorphology was changing all the time. And so there was actually an evolutionary advantage to having this pioneering life history. So most salmon populations have this sort of baked into the cake. And what we're saying as part of our research is straying might not be that bad if they have a good place to go. So if they have a good place to go, you could actually recover salmon populations through these straying processes if we stop viewing straying as being such a bad thing. So it's a little bit of if you build it, they will come. And they're definitely composed of strays, primarily from hatcheries. But why is that a bad thing? If we can get it up to where they're producing all these natural smolts, that seems to be better than sending them all back to the hatchery where we're doing the same thing and we know it's not working.
Hi, Andrew. This is David Conover.
Oh, hello.
Hello. I want to ask you some other questions in the chat, but about the salmon. So if there must be some opposition to the idea of taking the juvenile salmon and putting them in these flooded winter fields, which is an artificial habitat and not natural habitat. And then I'm wondering if there is that sort of opposition in the same sense that some people oppose the use of hatcheries to prevent natural production. But also then with respect to the migration, how are you dealing with the period when smolts are imprinting on the odor of the river if they're coming from a rice field? How's that going to work?
Yeah, so a couple of common questions that we field a lot. So first of all, yes, it is somewhat controversial, but who it's the most controversial with is the state fish agency.
Yeah.
And I don't think that everybody feels like this, but I think that there's a fear of like rice fields becoming another type of hatchery that could put hatcheries out of business or something like that. I don't think there's much truth to that because the spatial footprint of the fields that we're interested in is actually quite small. we're just looking at rice fields that have a natural and existing floodplain dynamic with the river. Most of the 500,000 acres are outside of these bypasses, these sort of floodplain areas. We want to kind of work within these areas so that fish can egress on their own. You know, we don't want to get into a situation where we're like trucking fish around or things like that. We want to kind of get them on the fields, maybe even volitionally, like they flood in on their own and then they leave on their own as well. And that's better for the growers too, because they don't want to get into, you know, permits and owning trucks and becoming fish managers or anything like that. But that sentiment is out there. I think too, just kind of the uncertainty of how this could work at scale scares some people. But those are things we can work out with more science and with small pilot projects that demonstrate the potential. And then the question about straying is a common one we get as well. Currently, we're working with fish that come from the hatcheries. So they come from the closest hatchery, and then we place them on the field. But they've been in the hatchery for months. So we think that they will. They've already imprinted on the river that they came from in that sense. But we're studying kind of the straying rates of the rice-reared fish as we've done it over the last few years. So we should learn more about that soon. But we don't think there's going to be a high degree of straying. And a lot of what the state is already doing to improve survivorship involves, you know, barging fish to the delta and trucking fish downstream so they have higher survivorship rates. And this is actually probably a better form of that because we're wilding the fish in these sort of more natural conditions. So we'll understand a little bit more as time goes on, but hopefully that helps.
Yeah.
Good to see you, by the way.
Yeah, I'm this whole idea of imprinting and straying. Those two things are really interrelated because I think I don't follow the salmon literature that much, but imprinting itself undoubtedly has a certain amount of plasticity to it. So not every fish imprints as well as another fish does. And then the experiences those fish have after their initial imprinting might influence their ability to actually return to the correct stream. So because they're not imprinted very well, then they stray more often.
I think that's true. And you know, the question is what's the appropriate amount of straying that we're comfortable with?
Yeah.
You know, I see other states that manage salmon in ways that kind of they're okay with a degree of straying, and it seems like that's probably a good thing.
I have some questions in the chat. Peg actually had a related question, so we'll go with that, and then Monica and Michelle. In the Willamette Valley, people have been looking at floodplain grass seed farms as overwintering salmon habitat in the same way. And I think here, strain, is it probably strain is something of a concern, and she was asking. So I guess that's a related question.
I see she wrote stranding, and that is a concern.
Not a typo. Sorry, I'm new to this world.
No. You know, kind of what can happen in these floodplain systems is that, you know, if they're not kind of you know, have structures for fish to egress properly, they can get stranded on the fields or in the floodplain, and you can lose fish that sort of way. So that's a lot of, you know, when I showed that schematic of like fields that had ditches and things like that, that's what we were thinking about for that, is ways to improve the egress of fish in a natural way, such that they wouldn't get stranded or things like that. You know, in California, we see that more often with like very large species of fish, like sturgeon can get stranded on floodplains, and the state actually operates these huge traps to catch sturgeon in the floodplain just to ensure that they don't get stranded. So those are all legitimate things to be thinking about, and that's a proper role for humans to play, is thinking about, you know, when we do these restorations and floodplain things, are there is there infrastructure we can build to make it more wildlife friendly, more fish friendly, so that we don't have those sorts of impacts?
And question from Monica, is there any resistance for this type of conservation project from other stakeholders? And she gives an example, imagining perhaps people that are pro river damming, and asks how you deal with every stakeholder being given a positive support.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, there's opposition from everybody for everything. And, you know, I try to just let the science guide the discussion as best we can. You know, there's certainly a segment of people that are interested in damming rivers more. You know, there's a fundamental problem with storing water. You know, if you need this much water, there's only so many ways you can store it. You can build reservoirs, you can get good at groundwater recharge, or you can store it in other ways, like restoring mountain meadow systems in the mountains and things like that. And you know, probably not dissimilar from like a green energy kind of things. We need to have kind of an all of the above sort of strategy. We need to be looking at all of these different things in creative ways. You know, with the reservoirs, there's a couple of proposed reservoir projects right now in California that would rely on creating a new reservoir that would only fill up during very wet years. And then you would sort of like live off the fat of that one wet year from this reservoir. So people are talking about things like that. They're talking about interesting groundwater recharge strategies, flooding orchards and things like that. Again, the mountain meadow restoration. So there's, you know, all sorts of ideas. But, you know, you got to have science. You got to be able to, you know, have really high quality science to look at those things in depth.
Michelle has her hand up.
Hi, and I loved your last slide. My question is really, is Ray troll worship wrong? If people thought my first comment was just off the wall, it's because you don't know that Spontu Die is an iconic Ray troll poster, t-shirt, and now you can get Spontu Die masks, which I gave you the link for too. But my real question has to do with actually now it applies to the grass seed issues too, and I wonder about it with the birds. I think this kind of cooperation and communication with the farmers is phenomenal, and it's amazing how much success you guys have had. And in Florida, there's actually some really good stuff going on now with the family ranchers who want to keep their ranches intact, and they're doing great stuff for the Everglades. But especially with juvenile salmon or birds that are going to lay eggs, I'm just wondering about pesticide runoff and the chemical problems, because they're going to be, it seems like get rather high exposure in this situation.
Yeah, for sure. So just a couple quick comments on the first point. You know, I've been just consistently impressed by how organized the growers are and how motivated they are to make a difference. And you know, yes, they are motivated by the money, but they also want to do the right thing. They don't want to, you know, go down in history as the people that made these species go extinct. They want to be part of the solution. So that's been kind of refreshing to see. So I get the herbicide pesticide question quite a bit, and you know, we haven't gotten too deep into it. It's definitely something I'm interested in. What the people that study this tell me is that the half-life of the chemicals that they do use for the conventional rice rotation is short, on the order of 3 or 4 months, is I think what they say. You know, do I think that there's no impact on fish rearing in the landscapes that have been exposed to those chemicals? No, I don't. I think that there is some impact, and we want to understand that at some point. What the growers tell you, because I've asked them about organic versus conventional rice quite a bit, what they'll say is the price that they're getting on the market is just not high enough right now for the organic varieties.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would have to sell a bag of rice for, $12 or something to turn a profit on it. And the amount of production that you lose by switching to organic rotation is such that it's just not worth it for them. But the other thing is there's actually some regulations that are getting in the way. So right now the state of California mandates that you have to fallow your fields for 3 years before you can convert from conventional to organic. And there's a lot of farmers that just aren't willing to take the 3-year hit to convert over. There's some that are thinking kind of creatively, will take a multi-year drought when they can't get water anyways, and use it as an excuse to fallow their fields and convert over. But there's probably a regulatory solution in there to be had for somebody that's good at it to make it easier for growers to switch over to organic.
Just a tiny follow-up. If the chemicals, for the most part, are short-lived, then a really important thing that people don't think about a lot with a number of things with ecological interactions is the timing. Is the application period at a time that's like less likely to give fish exposure, or are the fish there when the application period is actually going on?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right about that, because you're dealing with endocrine disruptors. The timing is everything. The advantage here is that we're dealing with winter flooding. So okay. Off cycle, they're done with the crop, usually around October, they're harvesting. Then the fields are sitting there for a couple of months, and then they get flooded up, Christmas time, a little bit thereafter. They stay flooded till about March 1. And then planting is usually around, right about this time of the year. They'll empty the fields and flood up around that time. So it's the best possible scenario for chemical degradation. But like I said, if I'm taking bets on if there's an effect or not, I'm not taking the no effect bet. I definitely think there's something, we just don't understand it yet.
Thanks.
We have 2 more questions from students in the chat, and then maybe we wrap up the formal conversation, but have everyone carry over into tea time. First question is from Cal. Are there any potential pest insects that fish can consume as a benefit?
Oh yeah, yes, there are. There are, weevils and things like that. The difference here is that again, we're using the fields off cycle, so they're not growing the crops and the fish at the same time. They're done with the crop, then they're growing the fish. Now, another thing we've talked a lot about, I get this question a good bit, is whether just the excretion and egestion of matter from the fish facilitates higher crops, the next year, things like that. That's definitely something we want to look at as well. We just haven't gotten there. But in other parts of the world, say like China, Korea, they've been doing rice and fish co-culture for a long time. And in a lot of ways, what we're doing is we're mimicking these systems from other parts of the world that we know work really, really well. It's a little bit different because we're doing this off-cycle thing, but they do co-culture of fish and rice, as well as other plants. And there is this pest benefit where they use different species. They use like carp and things like that. And, the carp will literally nose the plants to bump these bugs off into the water and consume the bugs. So there is this sort of pest management layer on top of it. We've talked about doing some co-culture work as well. We'd have to use different species. There's something called Sacramento blackfish that's can tolerate really high temperatures, really low oxygen. We'd have to use a species like that that's very resilient to the harsh conditions that would be there in the summer. But yes, that sort of stuff is possible.
Cool. And then final question from Ori. Are there issues for the salmon with methylated mercury in the rice fields?
Yeah, yes, there are. So, anytime you're dealing with a floodplain environment, you're dealing with soil that's going anoxic, anaerobic. That's creating a situation where bacteria, sulfur-reducing bacteria, things like this, can latch onto a mercury molecule and respire it, methylate it. And so, across the world, in the Amazon floodplain forest, you have high mercury concentrations in those fish because the biogeochemical conditions are such that it just presents that. One thing I haven't talked about today, it's a little bit more of a nascent set of experiments we've done, is there's a very interesting greenhouse gas part to the story. So rice fields in general are huge producers of methane, which is a greenhouse gas climate change multiplier. And about 4x the climate change effect from methane as carbon dioxide. So these rice fields produce a ton of methane for the same reasons they methylate a lot of mercury.
Sorry.
And we have some evidence that having fish on these fields drastically mitigates the methane emission from the fields. And the way it works is by way of a trophic cascade. So the fish will graze the zooplankton down, and that will allow the methanotropic bacteria to increase in abundance, which kind of balances out the methanogenic bacteria, and you get this net decrease in greenhouse gas flux. So there's a very interesting kind of error control part to this story that we hope to explore in the future and have some good preliminary data on it.
Awesome. Well, please join me again in thanking Dr. Rypel for coming to speak with us. And am I right? The tea time is just in this space, right, Peter? All right, so stick around for tea time. Pretty sure Andrew got his teapot ready for this. Maybe take a quick break to take care of one's body and then return triumphantly for tea time. It'll be great.
Right.